Welcome to this session of the Bristol Festival Future City. My name is Paul Gough. I'm the Pro-Vice Chancellor and Vice President from RMIT University, Melbourne, Australia. We have with us Claire Mookerjee, designer, urbanist and project lead for urbanism for the Future Cities Catapult, who is involved in people-centred urbanism. Mark Miodownik, Director of the Institute of Making of University College London and author of Stuff Matters, who will look at the future material needs of urban areas. And after their short presentations, 15-20 minutes each, there'll be a chance for a conversation. I'm looking forward to hearing your observations, questions, queries. We'll be joined by Gladek, founder and CEO of Metabolic Netherlands, for a discussion around the key ideas of future cities. So, to start us off, delighted to ask Claire to go to the lectern.
It's very nice to be here today. I'm from an organisation called Future Cities Catapult. We are, as I mentioned, government-backed, and we work to try and help scale some of the best urban innovations to make cities better all over the world. So what I'm going to talk to you today is about designing future cities for people. So my background is very much in thinking about how we interact with our built environment and how that creates particular kinds of social and democratic and human conditions, and very much at the street level. So this street you can see here, this is how I imagine we experience cities at eye level. And this is the way that we experience the city at a particular rhythm, at a particular pace, is because of our walking speed at 5 kilometers an hour. The way we choose to occupy space is influenced by climate. It's influenced by which side of the street the sun is on. And all of these factors kind of very much define how we inhabit space and how we experience cities. So I used to work for someone called Jan Gehl, who spent his career developing a methodology to understand why, even though we know this about cities, we started to build cities like this. So this is Brasilia. So modernism and the sort of siloed professionalism around transportation planning, around thinking of buildings as machines for living, created a particular type of urban condition, and one which isn't actually particularly well suited to us, to our sociability, to our sense of self, or how we operate together. And this he called kind of a birdshit urbanism. It's basically from 3,000 feet, people looking over places and thinking that they can design them like a solution. So thinking that cities and all of us living at agglomeration is a problem to be solved. And this is, again, a similar approach then when technologies started getting involved with cities, that many technology companies also thought about our lives at the urban scale as problems to be solved. And this Mazda and kind of a number of cities across the world have seen that these new technologies, new products and services have played into the same mistakes of the past, of the 20th century, of kind of siloed approaches to different ways of being in urban space. And this segregation between transportation that you see here is playing out in different ways and through the new products and services that sit on top of cities. So I think the things that we learned through kind of the urban sociology of the 20th century, of thinking about why we like particular cities and why they create particular cultures, is thinking about this sense of accretion, how a city which has an intelligence built into it over time and develops spatially in response to that, has a lot of humanity built into it. Cities which have commons, have spaces for people to express themselves in a number of ways, for there to be collaboration. Of course, that's the reason we live in cities anyway, and the expression of difference. And I think when we think about designing future cities, we need to think about, of course, future trends and technologies, but also the fundamental things which don't change, and why we think Siena is still a fantastic, amazing place to live. There's a huge market for smart city applications, for these new technologies and products which are going to shape the way we live in cities. And that's a huge opportunity, and it's a challenge as well. It's a design challenge for people operating in this space. And I think so Evgeny Morov's architects of, gives a really interesting account of some of the new technology companies and how they are applying design to solutions. And he talks about this solutionism. So thinking that actually situations in cities are a problem that need to be solved. And this idea that we should design out inefficiencies and ambiguity and disorder. And I think that's one of the things through some of the projects I'm going to talk about that I think we strongly want to kind of like counter, is to try and understand our cities and how we design our cities, including those new technologies, understanding the complexity of those places and the things that create delight. So infrastructure is kind of a dry word, but actually infrastructure is very important in how we actually experience place and the kinds of lives we're able to live in those particular places. And we have to kind of capture this and understand the value of inefficiency and be able to measure that to demonstrate its value to decision makers and be able to sort of design that serendipity into cities. And this really is about thinking about both the built environment, but also the technologies and the new services which come to sort of mediate the way that we use the built environment. So how we think about how we want these interactions to play out in the future cities so that we can set the agenda and set the design question in a way is very important. So I'm going to talk about a few projects very quickly, but with this idea of urban interaction design around it. So thinking about interaction designers from the sort of kind of user interface, internet world of design, but applying that to our experience in the city, applying it to a whole journey from when you leave the front door of your house, move through the city and end up at your destination. To think of it in these terms, I think is really useful. And so there are 4 principles that I'm going to quickly talk about. One of them is prototyping, to think about the city as not a static thing, but something which we can change dynamically. So this is a project that I worked on briefly when I was at Gell Architects. So Times Square in New York wasn't really a square at all, and the people of New York said that they didn't want to have any more public space, that they didn't want a sort of cafe latte culture, that what they wanted was to actually get from downtown to uptown quicker. And so the Janet Sadiq Khan, who was the transport commissioner at the time, did a project overnight with just $1 million and existing staff to temporarily try out whether this space could actually be pedestrianised and have kind of tables and chairs everywhere. The whole project was actually stretched all the way down Broadway and kind of rationalised the space. So whilst managing to increase journey times by pulling out corners and sort of rationalising the traffic, they also created more public space than 8 Piazza Navonas in Rome. So they kind of created this incredible sitting room for the city, whilst kind of achieving this other objective. And I think doing that in a temporary way is sort of very compelling because you don't actually have to consult in the traditional way when you do any built environment project where you kind of ask people's opinion and you pin up drawings on walls, but you actually test something out at very low cost and people can kind of give their answer with how they behave, with how they kind of show their like or dislike. This is a project called Cities Unlocked, which was a prototype that we did at Future Cities Catapult with Microsoft and guide dogs. And it was a trial technology to see if you could create a 3D soundscape to guide people with sight loss or who'd completely lost their sight through the city. And what we did was we really tried to find the human insights to help Microsoft, who were really answering the technology question, to kind of really shape that process. And so this is a video that I'm just going to quickly show you, where we went around and shadowed people with sight loss and looked at their current coping mechanisms as they walked through the city and how they experience the different transport systems and the different, basically, systems of the city and the seams between those things.
Okay. Thank you.
Well, eventually the member of staff did turn up and we got as far as the entrance and he said, I can't help you any further, and has left me here. So I now need to call on a member of the public to help me to the number 23 bus. Good girl. Good. Excuse me. Excuse me. Excuse me. Excuse me. Do you know where the number 23 bus stop is by any chance? For Oxford Street. Oh, not to worry. Thank you so much. Don't worry.
And you start to see how kind of, even though TfL go to great lengths to train their staff, etc. the way that we construct our city together still creates these seams. And to think about how technology can help someone who really does need help more than everyone else through that space, you need to kind of like set the challenge up correctly in the first instance. So we worked to develop this library of insights, and then we created this prototype from someone's home in Reading through to Paddington. The 3D soundscape worked by creating a path, so if they veered off that, the sound would change, and also delivered real-time information about buses and trains and things. The other thing we're really interested in at Future Cities is thinking about future services and the changing ways that our expectations and the way we live will impact on our built environment and the infrastructures. And so we worked with Glasgow University, who were doing a huge development up at their campus. They have a very traditional style campus. It's kind of an ivory tower on a hill in the city, and they're extending it out at the cost of £800 million. And they had traditional master planners, architects, and everybody working on this. But we went in to try and work with the faculty to understand what the future of delivering higher education will be like. So we went in and did a whole range of ethnography with students and staff across departments and looked at their existing built environment and how it's performing for people in different ways. And by having this approach, we found out all sorts of interesting things, interesting insights, which really could potentially impact on how they develop in the future. So just by finding out how much they use their rooms, we found that each department was actually very defensive of their space, as most faculties are in universities. And their buildings were only used, their meeting rooms, 20% of the time. So 80% of the building stock was lying completely empty most of the time. So we started talking about if you could have an Airbnb booking style system for the university. The university's wayfinding and kind of distribution of information, they were desperate to get more people from the city in, but they didn't have any interface with the rest, other higher education and colleges across the city. So by starting to kind of unpack the current use, the current attitudes and cultures, you can start to join up thinking about how education will be delivered in the future with how you design a campus. So this was a smart campus strategy that we came up with for them. And when you think about massive online learning and all the different ways, all of the undergraduates now access their set texts on Kindles. And so the library was actually fairly empty and was emptying out every year in different ways. And so without capturing some of these insights and then playing it back to the very traditional built environment team that were doing this, there was sort of building in problems for the future. As part of that, we're very interested in looking at trends, at looking at how, we're shifting to kind of look for experiences from our cities rather than necessarily ownership over parts of them. And also the kind of changing models of collaboration. This is an example from San Francisco, where the city, rather than asking for people to ask for permission to do particular projects, gives them a toolkit in order to turn a car parking space into a park, either temporarily or for a few months. And this changing conversation, I think, is really interesting. The third one that I was going to mention is future government. So we have 18th century institutions facing 21st century problems. This was something Marco Steinberg said. And I think it's very true in terms of how we think about how we run our cities, and the kinds of challenges we face now are very much 21st century challenges. However, we don't necessarily have the institutional agility to think about them in joined up ways. We're doing a project currently with Space Hive, who is a civic crowdfunder who did an amazing big slide here in Bristol, I I think about 18 months ago now, where lots of people came together just to put a little bit of cash in to make this slide happen. And it's interesting so we're now working with mayors across the UK to understand how they could deliver funds and create publicly funded projects through this mechanism. Because when a citizen puts an idea on the platform, it gains community support and traction, and is also sort of de-risking that public expenditure by showing people's enthusiasm for it. And so we're exploring how this could be a new delivery mechanism, essentially, for cities across the UK. And this general widening of the commons, the ability for people to affect change in their own cities, we're seeing in a number of places. And that with it is bringing this ability to kind of express changing cultural preferences. This is Studio Octopi, who did a floating Thames bath. They got a feasibility study crowdfunded. And you see these sorts of wild swimming and outdoor swimming projects popping up all over London now. And whilst the mayor and the city authority didn't necessarily know that this was something that people wanted, you're starting to see this groundswell of support around particular things. And so it's a new, interesting way of doing consultation. So Justin McGurk asks, can commoning be scaled up to influence the workings of a metropolis, able to tackle questions of housing, energy use, food distribution, and clean air? And this is an extension of that idea, but I think it's interesting to think about how, as we are able to influence our cities more, could we be very much more a part of answering some of the critical, really serious challenges? There's other ways that cities could also think about behaviour change and do. In the 2014 tube strikes, some of the lines were off and others weren't. And it was found looking at Oyster card data that afterwards 1 in 20 people didn't revert back to their normal commute to work. They maintained the new route that they'd found. So the strikes had a net economic benefit to the economy because people had adjusted their behaviour and improved their behaviour in a way. And so thinking about how cities actually do more with the infrastructure that they've got is also really interesting. Questions around what's the role of city government in the sharing economy and who are the asset owners for some of these things is really interesting. Barclay's Bike costs £20,000 to run and operate. And this is a picture of Brompton Cycle Sharing Scheme, where they're slowly but surely putting these stations all around the UK. And it's kind of interesting question to think what the role of, when we're in a kind of climate of shrinking government, what the role for city government is in being the asset owners in the sharing economy. Again, this is an example from Denmark, Air Donkey, where people are using their own bikes with number locks to become this kind of system of sharing bikes. And to kind of take that a bit further, sort of, will there be self-owning infrastructure in the future if we've got fleets of autonomous vehicles acting as public transport? They can almost be their own little businesses in their own right, taking that cost potentially away from government. Finally, the last one that I'll leave you with is we do quite a lot of storytelling at the Future Cities Catapult. We're really interested in how stories can let you try on a future for size, how if you articulate something well and kind of suspend people's disbelief about the future, it can be really, really useful. I'm going to skip over this because I've already run over time. But I'll just leave you with this one, which is a video we didn't actually make, but I think a future of autonomous vehicles was kind of interrogated very well here. And I think it provokes some of the questions about how we want our cities to feel and look and be.
Claire, thank you very much.
Thanks.
Thank you. My university in Melbourne has a huge campus in Ho Chi Minh City, and anyone tried to cross the road in Ho Chi Minh City, it's exactly like that, but with 20 times as many mopeds in your way. So it's an act of faith. And going from Claire, thank you very much, to Mark Miodownik, another act of faith. Mark works at UCL in London, and he's going to talk to us not about his subject, but about space utilisation in universities, Mark, I thought.
Oh yes, now I'm going to suddenly talk about that.
Over to you, Mark.
Yeah, it's interesting, because I think there's some things that I think that what I'm going to say I'm going to say, as a kind of unashamed technology optimist, materials engineer, and I think a lot of it actually there's some commonalities between our approaches, and I think there's also quite a lot of conflict. I think that's going to be right for a good discussion, actually. So, but before I go into essentially some of the work that we're doing on future cities and what we think might be the materials that you need to build them and the technologies you need to build them, I just want to talk a bit about materials in general. It's my subject, and I like to kind of just start off with the mundane, because I don't think actually much of what we perceive as mundane really is that. So this is just a picture in London outside my own lab, and you know, it's just it's full of materials. If you take these materials away, you don't have a city anymore. You have a field, and part of what cities are I would argue, a reflection of our needs and desires. They are an expression of us. You look around, and this is who we are. We live in a rainy, windy place, so we build buildings. And in order to build a building that will stand up for any length of time, you need to have materials that will do that. And we created them. And it's because we want a bit of comfort, but we don't want to be constantly wet and muddy. We want clothes. We want to be able to drink things out of cups that we enjoy, and all these things, each one of those created a material, and each one of those materials was a revolution in its own time. And that's why the ages of civilization are named after materials, and city building is a material activity. It's obviously about people, but I think it's about materials too. I think that there is a constant dialogue between us and the material world, and I would even go so far as to say they are not as important in us, but they are a big part of us. They really express something about us. So we created all these materials, we made these cities, and many of these materials were created by people from the arts, from makers, craftspeople, thinkers, some scientists. Actually, relatively late on, science gets involved in the act of making materials. But now, one thing that material science does for us is it really provides an excellent tool for creating new materials. And I would say if you look to the future, as we're doing this afternoon, about what cities will be like in the future, one of the things you have to do is say, well, what are our needs going to be in the future? What are our desires going to be in the future? What are our passions going to be? And of course, who knows? But you can take some guesses. And so once you take those guesses, right, so there's climate change coming along, so the needs bit of it is perhaps easier to kind of rationalize. You can then say, well, what tools do we have to make materials to mitigate against those risks or create those needs and desires? And this is the tool. So I'll just spend a few minutes. It's really the sum total of our knowledge about how material gets created and has its properties. And it's all about scale. So big stuff at the top, small stuff down here. And I've got two sides to this line. I've got the living matter and I've got man-made matter. Now, this is quite easy on the living side of things to describe, because most people have a real sense of the fact that living things have interior lives, that there is structure inside structure inside structure. So you have big things and smaller things, and then if you look at a mouse, and then the flea on the mouse, and then there's hairs on the flea, and then inside those hairs, it's made of tissue, which is many types of cell, and then there are single cells. So everything living starts from a single cell, and that's its Lego. It makes everything from that. And so it can make wood, it can make your teeth, it can make your hair. It's a kind of magic Lego block. And it's another story to tell you about the fact of how that works. And actually the truth is we don't really know that well. We know that there's stuff in the center of cells called DNA, and that provides information to create proteins and other molecules. And those molecules make these cells, and they can change into a bone cell, a ceramic, or they can change into a neuron. And just how it does that, how nature's managed that, is a fundamentally, mysterious process at the moment. But we're making progress. But the main point I want to say is that this is living matter. So what does it mean to be living? Well, no one really knows, but it's something to do with the fact that although the physics and chemistry of every one of these scales is exactly the same as the physics and chemistry on this side, in a brick, in a rock, in a carpet, that somehow this side of the world has something special about it. And what is that specialness? Well, it responds to its environment dynamically. It will reproduce itself. It will heal itself. It will grow. And the growth, or the dynamicism, comes from the fact that there's some demand at a big scale. Someone's chasing you. The weather's changed. It's winter. And that filters down into the microscopic scales, into the nanoscale, into the atomic scale. And it creates a change, and then that change filters back up to the macro scale, and these loops of information and then change in structure essentially is what life is, and livingness is. And it can be extremely complex. We have consciousness, and it's got to be something to do with that, although we don't quite know what it is. On the non-living side of the world, we've done a good deal of work, obviously making amazing materials. So we can make big buildings and robots and phones, and they do. If you look inside them, you have tiny wires. If you look inside those, you have tiny little micro machines. And you look inside those, there are tiny crystals. And we've got to grips with all these things. This is a single crystal of silicon here. You connect 1 billion of them together, and you have a mobile phone. We have a computer. You can do all these things that Claire's been talking about in terms of information. And it's down to a material technology, silicon, that lets you do it. And it's down to our ability to control really tiny things of the order, in fact, smaller than a cell. And if you go even smaller than that, you get down to atoms, and we know that there are about 90 odd naturally occurring atoms, and you can rearrange them in different ways, and you get different structures, and that gives you different materials. And if you change the stuff down here, lo and behold, you get a stronger alloy for a bigger building, or a stronger brick, or a bit of concrete, or a different computation outcome. So we've got the hang of the fact, a bit like nature has. We've got our fingers on the tools of how to make things quite complex. We can be quite proud, but we don't have living material. We are not making living materials, but we could, right? We reckon we could, and the reason, the philosophical rationale is that the physics and chemistry on this side is the same as that side, and we can fiddle at every one of these levels now. So we ought to be able to make a living bridge or a living building. The question is, should we? And will we? Will we desire it enough? Will we want it enough? Will it solve a problem? Okay, so just to kind of go through that argument, why would we want to do that? Well, we're going to have a problem with energy, and we're having a problem with energy, which is that we need to get off fossil fuels. Now, nuclear is going to be some part of that solution, but nuclear has its own problems. Wind is going to be some part of that solution, but it has its problems. But solar is really, really attractive. With solar, you only have to capture 1% of solar energy, and we can meet all our energy needs, current energy needs. That's quite an attractive option. Also, the idea of putting solar on the outside of buildings, generating energy, just like nature does in trees, exactly where you want to use it, that seems like a good place to be. So cities that generate their own energy from solar feels like a place we would want to go. But how would we do it? I mean, in a sense, we could do it now. Here's a building covered in solar cells. But it's not a very functional building. It's not an effective building for doing that. Why not? Because these solar cell panels are expensive, for a start, too expensive. They're individually made and then cobbled together. They're not changing their orientation to do with the sun. They're not dynamic. All these things you'd want them to be in order for them to be effective. You really want them to be part of the building itself as it's built, a bit like a leaf of a tree. And maybe to replace themselves, heal themselves, because once you start scaling up these things, you don't want to be repairing panel 43.4 up here because it's suddenly gone on the blink. You want it to repair itself. So the idea that we want to integrate energy generation into buildings and that we want that to heal itself, well, that feels a lot more like nature, like the way nature does stuff. And how would you do it? Well, again, it's just about scale. We can make panels of silicon. That's mature technology now. It's just too expensive. We can put them together in these big arrays, but it's kind of dumb. How do we get this stuff into buildings as part of its fabric? Well, the answer is down here somewhere, in the nanoscale, at the microscale. Now, already people are making little hairy materials that collect light, that can reorientate themselves towards the sun. And that, if you look at how nature does things, it optimizes each different scale in order to get the material of a leaf. You know, look at any plant, it's full of hairs. These things do things. So we haven't mastered, we can make complex objects as components of a phone or a laptop or a panel, but what we can't do is make that complexity as part of a building, as we're building the building. And I think that is a direction of travel for us, for these reasons, that we want to do this. The other thing is, once we collect this light, we're going to need to have it at night, so we need to store some of it during the day. And I think batteries are going to be a big part of buildings, because it's obvious that that's the way to store the energy. And you can see this with nascent sort of electric cars, and obviously your phones are quite a miracle of storage, aren't they? Lithium batteries. But again, that's really not going to be good enough for the kind of energy we need. We need much, much higher energy storage. So we're going to have to work out down to the microscale, the nanoscale, things like graphene and lithium materials, how to store energy inside buildings, maybe the fabric of buildings, maybe the foundation of buildings, or maybe even the structure will have batteries in it. Imagine an electric car, for instance, that the battery is not this block in the middle, but is the covering of the whole car. Like, could we do that? But it's actually about manufacturing methods and getting that complexity in there. Cars themselves are probably going to end up being electric and made of carbon. Why carbon? Because you can see it, planes have gone carbon because of this lightweight. They need to be lightweight and strong and stiff. And so carbon fibre has come to bikes, it's come to cars. But what we haven't managed to do, again, is really make them as thin and as light as we could. And again, this is all about joining up these miracle materials that we've invented, like graphene and nanotubes, and making big objects out of them. And again, it's a manufacturing challenge how to do this. And when I say that complexity is what nature does, it is part of the problem as well as the solution. So this is a bit of a dichotomy. So if you look at electric light bulbs, we brought in the compact fluorescence, or the EU did, because it wanted to have some energy efficiency. But a compact fluorescent has these many elements in it, right? And the red ones are restricted, risky supply, mines and areas where there might be conflict. Is that really what we want? Do we want to create solutions that rely on big supply lines in many countries with many mines in the world? And I think we're going to have to find out how to deal with this, because if you look at pretty much everything else, this is your mobile phone. If you have a smartphone, it has half the periodic table in. Each one of these is a mine somewhere, probably 10 mines in different places in the world. Again, the red ones are the places where there's conflict or supply risk, or they're in some other way endangered. So I'm saying to you that on the one hand, we want complexity because it solves some of our human problems. On the other hand, complexity brings problems of how we interact with the rest of the world, what other effects we cause, but also that these supplies might be cut off. And then there's carbon dioxide emissions as a result of all this, right? Which is, part of the problem in the first place. And if you look at cities and industry in general, it's the material content of them that causes a lot of the CO2 emissions. But when you go to industries like steel or cement manufacturing, you try and make them more efficient, it turns out they're very efficient already. I mean, really, those industries have optimized their processes. Why? Because energy is expensive, so they've optimized it. So we're not going to get factors of 2 even, or even certainly not going to get factors of 10 in efficiency gains. So how could we get those factors in order to make our cities more sustainable and have less CO2 emissions for building them? Well, it's obvious. You just have to make things that last longer. Instead of building a road that lasts 5 years, you build a road that lasts 50 years. How do you build a road that lasts 50 years, or a building that lasts that long? Well, you make it self-healing. And the other thing you do is you make it repairable in a way that's a circular economy. So we need to have ways to recover. If we're going to put complexity into our infrastructure, we need to stop throwing it into a hole in the ground at the end of its life, and it's got to come back into the system. So all of your mobile phones in this those elements ought not to leave this country. Right? Once they're here, they ought to be constantly recycled. And we are so far away from doing that, it's untrue. But it's ludicrous that we just throw this stuff away, and we do. The only goal really is to get back out of a mobile phone. So 49 other elements we just throw away. It's ludicrous. So we must go towards a more circular economy if we want more complexity in our cities, and we want more complexity in our cities because we want them to be more sustainable. So it's a kind of circular argument which is appropriate. And this is what I was talking about, self-healing materials. So there's self-healing concrete now. And you think, well, why would you want self-healing concrete? Well, because actually, you know, building a building or a bridge and then taking it down 20, 30 years later is just really bad for the environment. It's not a sustainable model. You really want little cracks not to grow into big cracks. And how do you get little cracks to not grow into big? Well, you make those little cracks self-heal. And the way this stuff works is it has little bacteria inside it, and these bacteria sit there, and when a little crack opens up, they get exposed to the air, and they look around, and they're hungry at that point, and they look for food, and the concrete manufacturers put food into the concrete. So they eat it, delicious, and then they self-replicate, and they have more eating, and then they all have a poo, and the poo is calcite, a mineral, so that's one of the main constituents of concrete. So they eat their way out of the crack, they get to the edge, leaving pristine concrete behind them, and then they run out of food, and then they die. That is obviously not a very ethical way to have self-healing, but still, it's little baby steps towards a more self-healing infrastructure. And there's many, many more self-healing technologies being built out there. So here's, I guess, just to sort of sum up, here's what I think the challenges are, but I think we're going to want a lot, harvesting energy, we're going to want self-healing infrastructure. We're going to move from an inanimate world into an animate world, I think little by little, because we can, partly, because we're really excited about it, partly, because it solves some of our human problems, partly, but the danger is we'll just end up ratcheting up complexity without any feeling for the environment. And we need to do something about that. Thanks.
Thank you, Mark. Thank you very much indeed, Claire and Mark. And I was going to ask Eva to come up with some quick responses to that, then I'll open it to the floor if you're happy to take a few observations from standing back from Claire was talking about ethnographic approaches, experiential design, and Mark talking about everything from the life cycle of that worm and self-generative building for fabrics, etc. So please, any responses would be very useful.
Well, there's a lot to respond to. So I'm just going to cherry pick a few things. So I'm a molecular biologist by training, so it's quite interesting to hear you talk about moving to living material object design. And I think that the whole risk of complexity actually can be quite overcome by a more biomimetic approach and actually designing materials that can intelligently interact with one another and actually simplify material complexity. So I think in some ways that can be addressed, but maybe we'll get into more details in the discussion. And overall, I think the whole living system analogy applies to the scale that you were also talking about, Claire, because one of the things that Metabolic has been focusing on, we've been doing a lot of urban development in North Amsterdam and actually creating sort of transition projects that look at both the material scale, so how can we materialize cities in a different way, but also the social interaction level. And I think actually creating rules or sort of criteria through which urban areas can develop, that they have to fit into certain sort of performance outcomes rather than dictating how they should be built top down, is a way to address both of these challenges in a way. Because if you say, okay, you can build whatever you like as long as it's non-toxic, does not use critical materials, addresses the right urban scale, etc., and then you allow the creativity of individuals and sort of new emerging technologies to fill in that gap, you can work on both of these scales. So, well, I'm sure we'll discuss more, but...
Thank you very much. Are there any quick responses you'd make to those observations? Then I'll open it up because there may be some questions. I'm hoping there's some questions out on the floor. Claire, anything you'd like to reflect on?
I think it's very interesting for the planning world to sort of think about these planning by tolerances or frameworks or principles rather than permissions. Because again, as you said, it sort of allows the natural order or creativity of people or materials actually to come forward. And I think that's what some people on the fringes of kind of planning innovation, there is such a thing, kind of considering. I think, so yeah, it's an interesting question.
Thank you. Mark, anything else?
Yeah, I thought you were also going to say, maybe it's too obvious a conclusion, which is that city, you can think of a city as an organism itself, right?
Mm-hmm.
Which is maybe something that you already consider, I'm sure you do. And I'm really interested in that, like the way in which cities themselves, and at the city scale, are an organism that has different rules again, and that the people scale is one scale, but there is a kind of many people scale that you kind of become part of when you go to a football match, or and it's a different scale, isn't it? And people who design for that scale, that's a different skill, and it sort of has different rules, doesn't it? And I presumably there's another scale again. And is it just that we should be designing cities for people, or do other of our creations have a right to have a bit of the city designed for them? Do cars have a right to have a better city for them? Like,
no.
Are we too human-centric?
In a cycling city, that is anathema. Questions, observations from the floor, please.
Hi, my question's mainly aimed at Mark. I'm also a material scientist, and I noticed you mentioned carbon and also embodied energy and carbon emissions, and I often think that the term carbon is kind of used a bit too loosely, and it misses a lot of the points surrounding the burning of fossil fuels, which is also like air pollution, many of which are also based on carbon. And you mentioned materials such as graphene, which is high carbon. What's your thought on the use, as a material scientist, on the use of the term carbon when we talk about climate change?
Yeah, no, you're right. And I kind of rattled through it. When I got to the carbon slide, I thought I haven't got much time here, so why have we taken to using carbon dioxide emissions as rather than energy usage as a thing? I guess because people have wanted to move away, energy usage that's from a renewable source. It feels like you can use that as much as you like, but maybe that's not really true, And maybe the fixation with carbon dioxide emissions sort of does lead us astray a bit. And I guess it is. I take your point entirely. I think it is it's a desire to simplify matters by using this one number or this one entity, when in fact what we're talking about is a very complex problem about pollution. It's about attitudes to energy and our value of energy, isn't it, as well as these other things.
Go on, Eva, and then there's
Yeah.
a colleague down here. Please.
Well, to add to that, generally the term that's used in the sort of sustainability world is greenhouse gas emissions potential, which is calculated in CO2 equivalents. And that's why it's shorthand for carbon. But obviously, carbon is not the same as CO2, and that shouldn't be conflated. And that's a very distinct problem from particulate emissions and other types of emissions that come from burning fossil fuels. So carbon itself is not the problem, and it's not even carbon, it's CO2 equivalents. So.
Yeah.
Thank you. In the centre there.
I was interested in Mark's opening shot of the materials on the Strand. You missed a couple of things out, which I suspect are both cast iron, and they're the Gilbert Scott phone box and a rather fine Victorian lampstand and lamppost. And I was very glad that Claire had not just Brasilia, but also Siena. Some time ago, the Heritage Lottery Fund calculated the embodied energy in a small brick terrace house, a Victorian, typical bylaw house, and reckoned that I think it was 7 or 14 times, it hardly matters, you could drive a car around the world. Embodied energy of that sort in existing buildings, not only, and also in the phone box, which of course is redundant, and the lamp standard, is really what gives a sense of place. And I think that needs to be sort of incorporated in this thinking of fantastic new materials and self-healing concrete and all that kind of thing. That's fantastic. But to give people a sense of rootedness and a sense of place, I think that kind of conservation. Just down the road from that shot on the Strand are the 3 buildings that King's College wanted to flatten and said English Heritage said had no particular significance, and there was an almighty outcry, and suddenly English Heritage said, oh, we've reviewed our decision and they're now going to be saved, which is a much better thing. And I think people will feel better about that bit of London as a result. So that kind of conservation, not just of it is of energy, but it's also of aesthetic and history and place.
Thank you.
I don't think, for me, I think there isn't just one answer to that. I think that there are many types of city, suiting many types of city life, and so there shouldn't really be one rule for all of those things. And that's what culture is, right? What those inhabitants decide they like, and they will fight for it, and they will fight for those phone boxes to stay there and have the postcards of all the women in there, in that kind of crazy cultural mishmash that it's turned into. And then you have other cities that basically renew themselves on a cycle of 20, 30 years, and everything changes, right? But what they can't do if you're going to be that kind of city is ignore the energy CO2 emissions impact. And I think if you look at a forest, you go back to the same forest. I would often liken I think modern cities will feel more like forests in the sense that they will be living. And that, for me, that's not a freaky thing, because you're quite happy in a forest and everything's living and everything looks after itself. But that forest is recognizably the same place from generation to generation, even though the individual trees have gone. And so just holding on to every single artifact, to me, is not necessarily throwing away the culture. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, I was just going to say as well, I think that cities do change at different paces, and I guess my slides were meant to articulate scale rather than materials or any different point in time. I mean, I think we have a really interesting and difficult relationship with heritage in this country. We're wedded to the brick, even though it is incredibly and it had terrible energy impact, and that's a complete kind of cultural phenomenon, because we take heritage seriously in this country, which is a good thing. But things like cross-laminated timber, all sorts of new ways of building housing and our cities are becoming available, and we are very, very slow to take up those, because we have this sense of identity attached to the brick, and I think it's a great shame. So I don't think it's any one material. I think it's about scale, and that scale in relationship to us. We don't change in scale, so I don't think our cities should necessarily either.
Well, I think another thing that I found really interesting, and now that you guys are both talking about materials and heritage, this whole shift towards designing cities in a circular way according to the principles of a circular economy, I think it also bears a lot of risk in thinking about how to use materials appropriately, because CO2 emissions and embodied energy are just one parameter, and it's not even necessarily the most important parameter. So actually, one of the things that we did at Metabolic was develop a set of 15 circularity factors for evaluating materials, but not just in a quantified way, in a sort of flat sense, but also in terms of how they should be used or implemented. So, for example, if you're going to create something that is disposable, then it should inherently be a short cycle material that can be recovered, and it should have low embodied energy, etc. So kind of matching the principles of what the material should embody to its function. And actually, bricks may not even be the worst type of material for buildings if they are destined for long usage and they have a long durability, and this is a kind of matching thing. So I think it's a much more nuanced discussion. With lighting, for example, you brought up the CFL example. If you focus just on energy as a parameter, then of course moving from incandescents to CFLs is a great idea, because you have an order of magnitude improvement in energy efficiency. But if you look at actually quality of life, because in terms of experience of the lighting, the narrower frequencies of those light bulbs cause depression when people are exposed to them. The other thing is that the red materials that you had highlighted, I actually thought you were going to say that it's not so much that they're conflict minerals, because only a couple of them are, the tungsten, but most of them are actually toxic, and that's a much bigger problem when you're introducing that into an entire supply chain. So it's balancing. We always need to look at a spectrum of indicators when we're making a choice about materials.
Hello. I just wondered if anybody on the panel had any vision of how cities in the future could, beyond becoming carbon, I'm using that consciously, beyond becoming carbon neutral to actually becoming sinks like a forest, so that they actually capture the stuff that we've already released, whatever that stuff is, and make it and capture it, but then find some way of decoding it or whatever and getting it recycled back. Could they become a positive rather than a drain of whatever kind?
There are technologies that people have developed already. There is some concretes now that absorb CO2, and they sort of grow their volume as a result of that. And then there's a really very beautiful technology that some people have been developing, which is to do with solar cells. So so the problem with storage of energy, which I mentioned about batteries, is batteries are one way of solving that problem. But another way is to convert the solar energy you get and get it to pick out carbon dioxide from the atmosphere and store it as a fuel. So you can do this in places where there's, let's say, a desert, and actually you can have an array of these things, and what they're doing is they're basically taking carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere and storing the energy as a fuel, and then you basically go and collect all the fuel and you use it as a biofuel. So that's not a city's example, because it doesn't really maybe it doesn't make so much sense in a city to do it that way. But anyway, people have been playing around with these ideas of collecting carbon dioxide.
Yeah, I think not from a material science perspective, but from an urban greening perspective, there's a huge opportunity with trees to do more in our city. In terms of air quality. And also I think, so the video that I showed with autonomous vehicles, I think there is an interesting future to imagine where we do have intelligent systems operating, and you can imagine the need for grade-separated streets or even paved streets. You can sort of imagine this nature being able to kind of creep back into our cities in a way which is perhaps hard to imagine now. And we do it kind of artificially in a landscaping sort of way, but could really fundamentally come back in the future. And even now, cities like Bristol and London have incredible amounts of green space when you kind of put together what people have in their garden. And if you get rid of lawns and start to kind of engage with planting and those natural processes in more meaningful ways, you could do an awful lot now anyway.
I think that moving cities to let's say, where they're actually carbon sinks, you can imagine a situation in which that's the case pretty simply, and that would be where every single building and every single form of energy use in a city is from a renewable source. Then eventually the cities pay back the cost of the embodied energy that was used to make those materials, and then everything that is a carbon sort of absorption starts becoming a sink of carbon. But the main thing that would actually have to happen for that to be possible is to actually retrofit cities or start to transition them slowly to a state where they are inherently energy neutral. And one of the challenges with that is that the density of energy demand in cities is extremely high compared to the ambient energy availability in the form of sunlight that's falling on buildings. But one of the interesting statistics is that actually buildings are now designed so inefficiently that we could easily save 70% of energy demand per building without even sacrificing comfort. So that's a first step. And then we can look at adding greening, looking at interesting materials that can absorb carbon. So it would have to be a multi-layered approach that would probably require an intelligent sort of plan for a couple of decades to achieve.
And on that very positive set of notes, I think we'll have to bring this session to an end, and it's been fascinating. I've learned a great deal, a huge amount about everything from ethnographic approaches, experiential design, the customized toolkits that you've talked about, and then the very materiality of the urban environment and self-regenerative building fabrics. I've learned a great deal. I hope you all have too. I thank everyone from this end here, encourage you all, as you will do, to go to the festival events. Brochures are outside. And finally, a huge thanks to Claire, Mark, and Eva. Thank you very much.